At the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman.
It's good to be here.
You know, I teach an undergraduate course, Joe, and it's a course on justice. And one of the things we were talking about is what it means to be a just consumer. And so the co-teacher asked each of the students to lean over and look at the tag on the shirt of the student sitting next to them and call out what country the shirt was made in. And it was like a United Nations of shirts in the room, because it turns out a huge amount of what consumers use every day comes from someplace else.
And you know, Pam, in some cases, a single object might come from a lot of places. You could have US IP in a chip that's manufactured in Taiwan, and it appears in a phone that's sold by a foreign producer.
Yeah, and it's really kind of amazing. Today, what we're going to do is look at some of the rules that govern how that trade gets conducted. Our guest today is a colleague of ours at the law school, Al Sykes. He's a lawyer and an economist. He's a leading scholar in the field of international trade. He also writes about torts and about contracts and about insurance, about international investment law, economic analysis of the law. And I understand you've written a paper with him recently.
Well, I convinced Al to co-author with me. We'll see about the success of that venture, but I enjoyed it.
I did too.
So, you know, in the news recently, there's been all this news about the Trump administration announcing some tariffs on steel and aluminum. And I guess the place to start is to ask, what exactly is a tariff?
Well, tariff is a border tax on goods coming into the country. It's either a percentage of the value of the goods, or it can be based on the quantity of the goods. So it might be 10% of the price, or it might be $10 a ton, but it's collected by the customs service at the border as a condition for allowing the goods into the country.
And then that tax gets kind of passed along to the consumer? It gets built into the price? I mean, how does it play out?
Well, ultimately, sure, the consumer will have to pay the price. It's possible sometimes that foreign sellers absorb some of the tariff to avoid the price going up by the full amount, but one way or another, it's included in the price that consumers pay, for sure.
And who decides what tariffs are? Can a country unilaterally put whatever tariffs they want? How does that work?
Well, so in the United States, tariffs are federal statutes. They're governed by the tariff schedules of the United States. In the old days, it was a matter of setting tariffs unilaterally, but in the 1930s, we began to, in response to a tariff war that began in 1930, we began to negotiate trade agreements. And these agreements embody commitments by the parties to them, the United States and our various counterparties, to put a lid on tariffs. And we've negotiated tariff reductions that have brought average tariffs down from something like 40-some% in the 1930s to more like 4% today.
And who's in charge of this agreement? If someone violates it, who hears a case? Is there a case? What happens?
Well, it depends on the agreement. There are many of them. We have the World Trade Organization, which contains the old General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is the largest multilateral agreement. But we also have free trade agreements like NAFTA, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, U.S.-Israel, a bunch of others. And the dispute system is different for each agreement. They're essentially their own freestanding bodies of international law. In the WTO, if there's a dispute, there is an agreement on how those are handled, and that involves beginning with consultations and then going to an arbitral tribunal and then potentially to an appellate tribunal. And then eventually the membership will adopt the results of the adjudication as binding law.
So how do economists think about tariffs? Are tariffs a good thing? Are they a bad thing? When are they a good thing? When are they a bad thing? Are they always good, always bad?
Well, I'm from the school of economic thought that tries to refrain from claiming normative dominance. I'm not sure if I know what's good or bad. I can tell you what's efficient or inefficient. I can tell you
what does it mean to talk about what's efficient or inefficient?
Well, so efficiency, one can roughly think of that as national income. Something that is efficient is something that raises national income. But it will also typically have some distributive consequences. You could raise national income in a way that disadvantages workers in the steel industry, for example. But if you're concerned about national income in the aggregate, I can tell you how tariffs affect that. And generally speaking, tariffs reduce national income in the aggregate with some limited qualifications. The reason is that consumers end up, to some extent, being priced out of markets because of higher prices, and they lose the gains from participating in those markets. And on the production side, tariffs tend to draw production into the domestic economy that costs more than what we could what we can get from abroad. We end up producing goods domestically that cost us more than we could buy them from abroad, and therefore, in that sense, we're wasting resources that we could use on something else.
So we grow sugar when we could buy it cheaper, or we make steel when we could buy it cheaper. Maybe.
Exactly.
Those are things you hear.
That's one of the standard inefficiencies or losses of national income that result from a typical tariff.
And at the same time, consumers here are paying more.
Consumers are paying more.
Their steel or their sugar.
Exactly. And the companies that make the stuff domestically will be able to charge higher prices because their foreign competition is limited.
So do they spend a lot of time trying to get tariffs? That is, our kind of industries in the United States trying to get tariffs to protect them against lower cost competition from overseas?
Oh, absolutely. That's the main political constituency for tariffs is domestic firms that are competing with cheaper foreign imports and that can raise their prices if the competition is either kept out through something like a quota or made more expensive through something like a tariff.
What are some examples of the kind of tariffs we had? You mentioned in the 30 they could be as high as 40%, and we're going to want to get back to that when we talk about trade wars. But how about the T-shirts that Pam's students were inspecting the other day? What's a typical tariff on an item of clothing like a T-shirt? We didn't have you look at this, Al, so if you don't know it, that's okay. What would you guess?
I would guess it's not zero. Textile and apparel has long been a sensitive category politically in the United States, so it's probably not zero. It's probably modest tariff of some sort, and I think it probably varies across different types of textile and apparel products.
I mean, one of the things that I've always wondered about is, do you put a tariff in when you're trying to create a new industry to protect it against overseas competition, or is it failing industries that are the ones that are trying to get tariffs?
It could be either. There's an old argument in economics called the infant industry argument, where the claim is that nascent industries require some protection against competition until they can kind of get on their feet and learn how to do things efficiently. And that's sometimes invoked as a justification for protecting new industries. But I think historically the political demand for tariffs tends to come more from established industries that are trying to avoid a decline in their profits from foreign competition. And so a lot of the highest tariffs we see tend to be in the industries where, if we take the U.S. example, the U.S. tends to be somewhat less efficient than foreign competition, things like textiles, footwear, basic commodity metal industries like steel, copper, and so forth.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking about international trade with our guest, Al Sykes, who's one of our colleagues at the law school. Joe?
Al, I want to pick up on something you said about the cost, the net costs of tariffs. As I hear you, tariffs would be a bad idea even if people didn't retaliate against us. I know one of the things you worry about with tariffs is a trade war, and we're going to want to pick up on that in a bit. But suppose the other parties don't retaliate for some reason. It's still a bad idea. Is that what I'm hearing in terms of reducing national income?
Right. So with that caveat, is if we're focused on national income and we're not concerned about the distributive consequences, then yes, tariffs will generally reduce national income because of the two effects that I mentioned before, pricing consumers out of the market and inducing high-cost production in the United States that substitutes for low-cost production abroad. So that's the basic traditional economic case for free trade on efficiency grounds. It suggests that you're actually better off if you unilaterally lower your tariffs, even without regard to what foreign governments might do in response.
I mean, one of the things, if I can just get back to, because you keep saying if we ignore the distributive consequences. And so I get a sense from a lot of people who argue in favor of tariffs that it's the distributive issue that they care about. That is, it's not so much consumer welfare as it is leading large chunks of American industries to lose the ability to compete because we have minimum wage standards, and the like. So how would we deal with those other than through tariffs? That is there some other way to preserve those kinds of good industrial jobs?
Well, of course, you can subsidize the industries and cover their losses. That's one way to preserve the jobs.
And would that have different effects than a tariff?
Yeah, it would avoid the increase in consumer prices, that is, that disadvantage consumers. It would still cause high-cost production to survive here in preference to lower-cost options abroad, so there would still be economic cost to it, but it would be different. The other possibility that economists tend to advocate for is not to try and save domestic industries that can't compete internationally, but instead to provide assistance directly to people who suffer adverse distributive consequences when those industries are lost. So find the individuals who are losing their jobs because of trade and give them additional unemployment insurance, give them assistance to retrain and move into other occupations, and things like that, which cost money, of course, but avoids the economic costs of tariffs, quotas, and other forms of protectionist measures. And, of course, there's arguments on the other side that those policies don't work very well, that the political support for them is inadequate, and so forth. So there's a lively debate over how to deal with the distributive costs of liberal international trade.
When we talk about distributive costs, I imagine it must get quite complicated, because I remember in the context we're going to focus on after the break, which is the specific tariffs mentioned, you have a goal of helping depressed towns, maybe in the upper Midwest, by supporting the steel industry, but the auto industry, which is more or less from the same parts, opposes the tariffs because that'll increase their costs of goods. Are there clear-cut agreements about how tariffs help and hurt within areas, and how do economists look at that?
Well, it's certainly a different issue if we're talking about tariffs on intermediate goods like steel that are then made into some sort of final good. Tariffs on an intermediate good may benefit the domestic producers of that intermediate good, but at the same time it will disadvantage, as you say, the downstream users of that intermediate good. Back in the Reagan administration, for example, there was a case in the International Trade Commission under the so-called safeguard provisions of U.S. law that sought tariffs and other restrictions on imports of refined copper. And the argument was, in part, that would restore mining and copper refining jobs in the United States. And the International Trade Commission actually recommended those tariffs, but the president declined to impose them in significant part on the basis of the conclusion that the downstream users of copper, in that case brass mills and wire mills, would actually lose more jobs than the upstream copper mining and refining industries would gain. So the calculation was made that sort of intermediate good tariff would actually worsen the distributive impacts of trade policy.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Al Sykes, our colleague at the law school, about international trade. Joe?
Al, you talked about economists being reluctant to kind of get into the fray, or at least many economists are, careful economists like you, on what's better or worse, but they'll give their opinion on what will increase national income. We're about to to segue a little bit to talk about the specific moves of the Trump administration, what is your sense of the economics community on those moves? Is it split? Are there supporters, defenders? Is there a consensus in one way or the other?
Well, I would say that economists tend to be free marketeers on average. We've all been educated in the efficiency case for free trade. We've all been educated on the argument that distributive issues might be better handled through other policy instruments like unemployment insurance and retraining assistance and so on. And so the general view of the economics profession is probably pro-free trade. There are exceptions. I certainly know people who are exceptions to that, but I would say that that's kind of the predominant economist reaction to this set of issues. So the predominant economic reaction would be that the tariffs that the Trump administration is pursuing might be a bad idea. But even that would be subject to a caveat if you thought that what was ultimately going to happen was not some sort of long-term protection for domestic industries, but rather that this was an opening salvo in a negotiation that would in fact result in the end not in protection here, but in market opening abroad.
So that raises two questions for me, Al. One of which I'll ask you now, and the other which I'll ask you later. But the one I'll ask you now is, why do you think it's so hard for the public discussion of issues like tariffs to incorporate the economic understanding? That is, you don't really see much in the general discussion of tariffs about the things that you say most economists just have been trained to understand. Where's the disconnect between economic understanding and kind of policy discussions? Where does that come from?
Well, I don't think it's the policy discussion so much as it is the political rhetoric where the disconnect arises. It's forever been true that people who are threatened by international trade can turn into something approaching single-issue voters on that particular issue. And politicians have figured that out, and they can exploit that. And so if you're campaigning in an area where trade-related dislocation is perceived to be an important problem, talking about protectionism as a solution has always been a potentially viable political strategy. And we see it a lot. We see it on both sides of the aisle historically. We see it sometimes sincerely, sometimes disingenuously, but we see it routinely, and it's because the issues I think are somewhat subtle economically. Those on the policy side that favors liberal trade often have a hard time in this world of short sound bites and political speeches articulating the case on the other side.
Well, we'll be back with more from Al Sykes in a few minutes, talking about international trade, next on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 121.